Hello, BookTube. It's Wednesday, and ordinarily that would mean Epic Comic Book Wednesday, where Michael K. Vaughan and I team up to talk about some sort of comic book related subject. But we'll have no Michael K. Vaughan comic book today. Uh, and I was tempted when I learned that, when he told me that he wasn't going to be able to make a video today, I was tempted to skip it. But I want to keep the comic book flame burning a little bit longer. I don't know how many more comic book Wednesdays I have in me for the year 2024. And it just so happens that I have a subject because I am reading. I am doing a Michael K. Vaughan style gigantic comic book project that I stumbled onto, and I'm very happy that I stumbled onto it. I'm rereading basically all of the adventures of Captain Marvel Jr. Fawcett Comics came up with a Superman ripoff character called Captain Marvel, the big red cheese, big guy in a little white cape who is essentially Superman, only with a magic word instead of a phone booth. So a boy named Billy Batson says the magic word Shazam and turns into Captain Marvel. A lot of you are familiar with this. You've probably seen the movies, starring a Trump supporter. And that was such a hit that immediately the powers that be decided they wanted spin-offs, lots of them. And so we get Mary Marvel. We get a young girl who says the magic word and becomes a superpowered female. We get Lieutenants Marvel. They aren't captains, they're lieutenants. They have different physical body types. They have superpowers. I don't know how many adventures they had of their own. But we get all sorts of Captain Marvel had a huge supporting cast eventually of weird characters, great villains, the whole nine yards. And also there was Captain Marvel Jr., a young boy named Freddie Freeman. He's not a Batson. He's not related to Billy or Mary. And he's a cripple. Walks around on a crutch. And he's poor. Sells newspapers on the corner for his daily bread. Lives in a boarding house. And he is mortally wounded and taken to the wizard Shazam, who gives him superpowers, just like he did Billy Batson. Only Freddie Freeman's magic word is not Shazam. Freddie Freeman's magic word is Captain Marvel. If he says Captain Marvel, he turns into Captain Marvel Jr. Not a grown-up version of his teenage self, but a teenage boy. He turns into a non-cripple, physically unbeatable duplicate of himself. Not in a red costume like Captain Marvel or Mary Marvel, but in a blue costume. No explanation ever given for that. The Lieutenants Marvel, their costumes look basically identical to Captain Marvel. Mary Marvel, costume looks basically identical. But even Uncle Marvel, there's an Uncle Marvel who does not have any superpowers. He just thinks that he does. He just wants people to believe that he does. He's a big fan of the Marvels. Uncle Dudley is a terrifically fun character, like the talking tiger, like a talking worm, like even the increasingly expanding Savannah family of evildoers. Uncle Dudley will constantly he has a Captain Marvel costume, but he's an old white-haired guy with a pot belly, and the Marvels humor him. They know he has no superpowers, but they humor him and don't let the rest of the world know. And Uncle Dudley will often complain that the reason he's not flying on his own is because his Shazam Bago is acting up. Always kind of funny. And the Marvels like to tease him about this, but except when writers make mistakes, Captain Marvel Jr. is the only member of the Marvel family who can actually tease him specifically about his Shazam Bago. Because if Captain Marvel or Mary Marvel said Shazam Bago, they would transform back into Mary Batson and Billy Batson. Captain Marvel Jr. can say Shazam all day long. It's not his magic word. But by the same token, he's the only superhero in the world who can't identify himself to the police or to worshiping crowds. When they say, "Who are you?" If he says, "I'm Captain Marvel Jr.," he will have said Captain Marvel and will transform back into Freddie Freeman. So I don't know what he says in that circumstance. It doesn't matter because A, everyone seems to know who he is already in these comics, and B, he doesn't seem to take much care about where and when he transforms. Every once in a while, a writer will have him remember to go down an alley Every once in a while, especially later on in the 1950s, a writer will mention that Savannah Jr., a teenage member of the Savannah family, of course thoroughly evil, is the only person who knows his secret identity, but most of the time he transforms just in full view of everybody. And Captain Marvel Jr. was a hit. He got his own book, and he also had the regular, usually the cover spot in Master Comics. I have been reading that whole mass of stuff, so not just Captain Marvel Jr., but Master Comics as well. I've been rereading these issues. I've read them all lovingly. Probably in the early 2000s, considering that I'm a 90s kid, that would certainly have to be true. These certainly were not the very first comics that I read, these and Superboy. These certainly are not the first comics that I read. That just couldn't be true, especially since the comic that we're looking at today came out in 1951. 1951. What kind of a museum fossil would you have to be to have been a kid in 1951? No, it's not possible at all. But I have them all together. I have the whole lump of them together, and I am reading through them, rereading them for the first time since the early 2000s. And I'm having a blast. It's a lot of fun. I see what Michael K. Vaughan sees in these unrealistic, protracted comic book reading experiences, and we're gonna talk just briefly today. It doesn't have to be a long comic book episode. We're going to talk briefly about one of those issues from 1951. This is Master Comics number 121, and there's the cover by Kurt Schaffenberger, who also did great work on Superboy. He drew both the blue outfitted, superpowered teenage characters that were going in the 1950s. And one of the most popular things, I've only seen 2 examples of it in illustrations online, but one of the most popular things that fans loved to request if Kurt Schaffenberger would be at a comic book convention. One of the things that artists like to do at comic book conventions is set up a table, bring all sorts of equipment, and take requests for money right there at the convention. And they will either do the request right then. All right, I'm taking your request, I'm taking your money. You wander around, maybe get some lunch in the cafeteria, and come back, and I'll have your sketch done for you. Or nowadays, artists will go to conventions and take full-blown requests. This is not a little thing. I'm not asking $75 here. I'm asking $75,000. I will draw you a finished version of the very thing you want to see for a large amount of money. If you give me a large amount of money, I will do that, and you will have a completely original thing. $75,000 might be overstressing things, but $7,500 certainly is not. That's why artists go to conventions now. And one of the most popular things that Kurt Schaffenberger used to get asked for at comic book conventions, people would come up to him and say, I would love it if you would draw a picture of Superboy meeting Captain Marvel Jr. It's not just a question of how similar the characters are, it's a question of him being a signature artist for both. And he often did. I've seen a couple of versions of them online. Don't have one myself. No idea what he charged for them, if he charged anything. From what I know of the man, if a kid came up and asked for that, he wouldn't have charged anything. It would have happily done it. And it wouldn't have taken him very long either, 20 minutes to do. This was before the marketplace cynicism really crept in. I know that Ted Williams, the great ball player, and also Magic Johnson, not Magic Johnson, but I'm blanking on his name, the Chief from the Celtics. Famous sports figures of a slightly later decade would specifically refuse the requests of kids who came up to them for autographs or whatnot, because they knew perfectly well an adult, not even necessarily their own adult, had sent them, hoping to work on that soft spot. So they just, Bill Walton and Ted Williams, a whole bunch of famous names in sports, got bad reputations for telling kids to scram. And of course, the kid is a pawn, so the kid doesn't know what's going on and starts to cry because their hero is just told them to buzz off. But this was before then. This was when it was still possible for at least one or two people that you meet in the course of a day not to be an absolute Richter scale jerk all the time to everyone. This was before those days. Those days are now upon us. They're not going anywhere. But once upon a time, that wasn't true. Once upon a time, a person you would meet on the street would be nice. They wouldn't have any ulterior motive. They would just be nice. And you can see on the cover here a little bit of what I am really enjoying about this character. These Master Comics was a compilation. Most comic books at the time were a compilation. You pay your 10 cents, and you get a whole bunch of little stories, and none of them are connected to each other, and none of them are connected to the previous issue or the next issue. You settle down with your main draw, the cover character, and a whole bunch of side characters. Captain Marvel Jr. was never really blessed with side characters. Adventure Comics, lots of good side stuff. Detective Comics, lots of good side stuff. But Master Comics, you had Captain Marvel Jr., but then you had, for a long time, you had Bullet Man, and then his assistant Bullet Girl, who were fatally flawed because they changed over time. You don't want your characters to do that. When Bullet Man is introduced, thanks to a super scientific process that removes impurities from his blood, he's suddenly super strong and invulnerable and able to fly. You can remove impurities from human blood all you want. You're not going to get any abilities like that. But he also had a helmet, a super scientific bullet-like helmet on his head. And he had all sorts of adventures where he was basically Superman. And then gradually, over time, he changed. By the time he acquired his assistant Bullet Girl, the helmets were not only super magnetic, so that if you shot bullets at Bullet Man or Bullet Girl, the bullets would be attracted to the helmets and bounce off, and allowed them to fly, but that otherwise they had no powers. And there was also Nyoka. There's a character named Nyoka, the Jungle Girl. She dresses like a United Airlines stewardess. She doesn't dress like Shanna of the Jungle at all. And I've never figured out what she's doing in the jungle. She's constantly out of her depth. She's constantly needing rescuing by her friend Larry. I guess Larry the Jungle Guy wouldn't have had a ring to it, but it's not a good backup feature. You're tempted to skip it. The issues also had comedic side features and westerns. Westerns were still very popular in the early 1950s, so you'd get Tom Mix in every issue of Master Comics. But the main attraction was Captain Marvel Jr., who had a book of his own at the same time, and also appeared regularly in Captain Marvel's book. And one of the aspects of this character that I'm liking, the more I reread these issues, I'm reading a batch of them every night, is the joy of flying. When Freddie Freeman says his magic words, he becomes a super powerful version of himself. Super strength, super speed, and the ability to fly. And from the beginning, Captain Marvel Jr. is shown flying more often in full view over a panoramic scenery down below than any of the other Marvels. Usually, I know it's up to the artist, but usually the artist for the Captain Marvel or Mary Marvel would show them flying, taking off, and then arriving, blasting through a wall, smashing through a window. Captain Marvel Jr., more than either of them by a wide margin, is shown simply flying in the air. And I like it. You get it here on this cover. Here he is taking off from an old-style aircraft carrier. And you get it all throughout the issue, too, where he... we get a absolutely ubiquitous ad to sell guns to little kids. A Daisy air rifle, which could be very, very dangerous. And so you get this warning. Show this message to your parents, is what the boys are being told. You'll never see a real outdoorsman aim or shoot his rifle at anything but a safe, proper target. He handles his firearms with a care and respect. Your Daisy rifle is made for fun shooting. It is not a lethal weapon, but like a knife or auto, it may cause damage if handled carelessly. So do not aim or shoot at windows, streetlights, songbirds, pets, property, or any other person, ever. Remember, carelessness causes accidents to millions of Americans every year in cars, homes, and factories. So if you are careless with your Daisy or abuse the privilege of owning one, your parents, guardian, or police have the right to take it from you and should. And should. So you get ads like that, but then we move to the main event, and the Captain Marvel Jr. story in this issue is Captain Marvel Jr. and the battling underworld. There we have a splash page by Kurt Schaffenberger, who's underrated. He's very, very good. He's very cartoony. I think that's why he's underrated. And this is a splash page in the true sense of the word, in that it is not drawn from the story. It's dramatized from the story. This could easily have been a cover. And the battling underworld in question is two groups of gangsters, two groups of bank robbers. A group of bank robbers has robbed a bank in the town, one town over from where Freddie Freeman is selling his papers. They made away with $10,000, which was $1 million when this story came out. But two of the group, in the excitement, stuffed some of the loot bags with old newspapers and handed those to their colleagues and split off from them, meaning to keep the whole heist for themselves. And they have holed themselves up in a cabin in the woods. One of them is skinny and one of them is fat. And they're congratulating themselves because they've got the whole loot to themselves. Unbeknownst to them, their colleagues have followed them. Here, hold on a second. Hang on just a second here. I have killed the brightness when that's not possible to do by touch. On just a random touch on a screen. It's not possible to do, and it is impossible. I've tried it. It doesn't work except when I'm making videos. Unbeknownst to them, their colleagues have found them at this little shack, and they fire into the shack to warn them. Why? No idea. But Captain Marvel Jr., who's been flying to this adjacent town in order to look into this bank robbery, hears the shots. See, he's far above the woods. He hears the shots and decides to investigate. And the criminals run when they see him. They know who he is, and he blasts into the room. And these two criminals lie to him. They tell him, we're not part of anything. We were just accosted by these criminals. They've already hidden the cash in the cabin. And Captain Marvel Jr. decides, well, they say, you can't just leave us here because those guys could come back. Captain Marvel Jr. has an idea. He will take them to the boarding house where he lives as Freddie Freeman and ask if they can have rooms there. He flies them there. One of the criminals says, this is the first time in my life that I flew, but I never felt safer. You're being hauled by the arm of a teenage boy. Why would you feel safe? But then Captain Marvel Jr. flies away again. And you see what I mean? This is what I'm talking about. We get panels like this all throughout his run, where he is just flying and there's a kind of enjoyment to it. Okay, hang on while I get the brightness back. Also, no way to lock the brightness, which is not true. That according to the guides that I see online, you can lock the brightness, but not on this machine when I'm making videos. I can lock the brightness at other times, but not when I'm doing this. So that's going to happen about 100 times in this video. Captain Marvel Jr. flies back to the shack to look for the thugs, but they're nowhere around. And we're told it's a few minutes later. And, right, he takes off from his town, Freddie Freeman's town, to look for these guys. In other words, reading this again, it appears that he's not all that fast. A flyer. He takes these guys to his boarding house. And the little old lady who runs it is perfectly happy to take them in if Freddie Freeman vouches for them. And there's an odd moment where Freddie Freeman says that he's tired and he's going upstairs to take a nap. This is a long time later. This is weeks later. Where these guys have been living there. But unbeknownst to them, their criminal associates have discovered that they live at this boarding house. They've driven by and seen it. Freddie Freeman says, "I'm tired. I'm going upstairs to take a nap." And the other two say they'll do the same thing. They all troop upstairs to take a nap. But Freddie Freeman can't sleep because there's a loud street noise of construction. My heart goes out to him. Little does he know that in the next room up in the boarding house, those two gangsters that we saw, the skinny one and the fat one, have been cornered by other gangsters who managed to come into the house when no one's around. Everyone's napping. And who shoot them dead using the noise of street construction to blanket the sound of the crime. Freddie Freeman, he doesn't hear it, but he thinks, I'm up anyway. The street noise is too loud, so I'm just gonna get a snack. The lady who runs the boarding house is Mrs. Wagner, and he says, I can smell Mrs. Wagner's pie baking in the kitchen. Mrs. Wagner's pies, that is just accidental. Her name is just accidental here, but still. Freddie innocently decides to ask if the two gangsters, who he doesn't know are gangsters, if they want a pie as well. He opens the door and finds them dead. And he starts to get suspicious. I thought the street construction was already done on this street. He decides to transform into Captain Marvel Jr. and fly to the City Hall, the Department of Street Repairs, and they tell him that no street repairs were authorized on that street. You see, we get all these panels of him just flying. Really neat. Also, we get a little bit of a fashion thing. I don't know if you noticed it in those panels. Let me show you the first one where it happens. Captain Marvel Jr. likes to wear his cape over one shoulder. It isn't thrown back. It's covering one arm, and it's not isolated. He does this when he's at City Hall as well. He does it all the time. He wears his cape like that. He figures the criminals probably used fake street construction in order to disguise the sound of their gunshots. But they'd have to rent the equipment. So he finds the warehouse where they would rent the equipment. The man who they took the equipment from is easily able to identify them. See, it's very simple Kurt Schaffenberger artwork here. I think it's that there's an underestimated mastery to it, and it never changes. His style remained remarkably consistent throughout his comic book career. He was originally a cartoonist. There were no great advancements. He just stayed doing what he was doing, and I loved it. He did a lot of Superboy comics that I have as well. Maybe I'll reread those one day. But in the meantime, while he's figuring out what's going on here, and he's figuring out, well, those two guys that were murdered at the boarding house, they didn't have anything on them when I brought them there. I flew them there myself. So they didn't have any suitcases, any luggage, certainly any treasure. So, and they didn't have any before they got into the woods because they were all part of a criminal gang. Now he knows they were all part of a criminal gang, which means the treasure, the loot has to be at that cabin. So he flies back to the cabin, and the criminals, their former associates, thought the same thing, and they find it in sacks with dollar bills on them. They find their loot. So their plan has worked. They were patient. They waited until they learned where their turncoats were, killed them, and then put two and two together and went back to the cabin. But it does them no good because Captain Marvel Jr. not only shows up, I guess somebody repaired that window from the last time that he smashed it. He not only shows up, but he knocks the stuffing out of these criminals. That's always, Schaffenberger always has a lot of fun showing him do that, just showing him smack people around. He's has the strength of Hercules. He has the strength to move that aircraft carrier on the front of the cover of this comic. He could easily lift it. So, of course, that punch should cut that guy in two. But you want these nice fisticuffs complete with Kurt Schaffenberger stars for punches like that, which is, it's going to strike a contemporary comic book reader as unbearably hokey, but I love it. Just love it. Captain Marvel Jr. is physically unbeatable. So all you've got to do is confuse him. That's what you do for your comic book, is confuse him. And there he is again. Once he's finished mopping the floor with these guys, once he's got his fashion sense back, he puts the cape over one arm. He collects the loot and flies off, deciding that he will carry the criminals to the police and bring the money back to the bank. The end. That's the end of the story. Those two poor criminals, he says that this is just how crooks always wind up, or like Skinny and Rolly, those are the two who paid with their lives for their crime. And that's it. That's the story. The battling underground. Two groups of criminals fighting over money, hiding it, and getting Captain Marvel Jr. and Freddie Freeman involved. No further complications than that, all done in very simple primary color artwork. I mean, look at that. Look at that panel. That's just wonderful. A couple of things that jumped out at me here. It's not just a question of changing times and the rising tides of cynicism. I honestly don't believe that an adult reader of comics today would much enjoy this, including myself. I'm not sure that I would much enjoy this if I weren't reading it through one of the most intense lenses of nostalgia imaginable. Because when I reread reprints of this in the early 2000s, keep in mind, I would have been a very little kid. And that, therefore, this has an incredible sweetness to me. But rereading it now, here, let me get back to the cover. Rereading it now, I notice a couple of things. Aside from Mrs. Wagner's pies, that's going to get some of you Simon and Garfunkel fans going. But rereading it now, I notice things that I didn't notice in the early 2000s when I read it as a 9-year-old boy. Which is how much the story changes from a Superboy story. A typical Superboy story. I mean, typically in his own book, in Adventure Comics or in Superboy was fighting gangsters too. And typically in a Superboy story at the same time, the whole crux of the story was, can you confuse him for the length of the story? Superboy is also unbeatable. Kryptonite really doesn't make that much of an appearance in Superboy's story. So he, like Captain Marvel Jr., is basically physically unstoppable. So that's not a question. It's not a question of you getting enough physical power assembled to give him trouble. Instead, you're going to have to put him to the test. You're going to have to test him mentally, test his wits. So taking a basic template of that story, I look at these two things and realize how much the story is different by the fact that Captain Marvel Jr. has no extrasensory abilities. He's physically strong. He's invulnerable, I guess. He gets the power of Atlas. He can fly. He's really fast, although as we saw in this issue, not blazingly fast. He doesn't travel. He doesn't appear to have super speed. But he has no energy casting abilities. He has no heat vision. He has no X-ray vision. He has no super senses. He has no super hearing. If Superboy were next door to a gunshot going off, it wouldn't matter to him that there was street noise. It wouldn't matter to anybody. It wouldn't matter to a normal person. It's just a gimmick for the writer. But it wouldn't matter to a normal person. It doesn't, trust me when I tell you, I am familiar with deafening street noise. And if a gun goes off in the next room, you're going to know that it's not the street noise. No street noise is that loud. And it doesn't sound the same anyway. And the only reason it works in this issue, the only reason that Captain Marvel Jr. has to wonder about where that treasure is or anything else is because he doesn't have these enhanced sensory abilities. He's just physically powerful. I found that interesting. A writer for a Superboy issue that did something very similar to this would have to tweak the story here and there to keep it going. But anyway, I am approaching the end of my reread of this character. I did all of the Captain Marvel Jr. issues first, and now I'm doing all of Master Comics. This is Master Comics number 121, and I have the artwork doesn't stay good, but I have This is Master Comics number 133. So not long to go, just 10 issues. So it's been a lot of fun. Lots and lots of fun. Sweet nostalgia, and also lots of fun to think about. Because this character doesn't exist anymore, just like Superboy doesn't exist anymore. So in DC Comics, or Fawcett was bought by DC Comics, and there's something extra touching to reading the adventures of a character who's not still having adventures. I'm in that lot with pretty much all my favorite comic books. I love Superboy, not super gay Superman's son, not a clone of Superman, the actual Superboy, the adventures of Clark Kent when he was a teenager. I love Superboy. That character does not have adventures anymore. Doesn't have a book of his own, much less 2 best-selling books of his own. Captain Marvel Jr., I think, is now Captain Marvel, or has long white hair, or is... I don't have any idea. I don't have any idea what's happened to the character, but he's certainly not Freddie Freeman turning into Captain Marvel Jr. in a bright blue costume. He's certainly not that. The Captain Marvel Jr. that inspired both me and Elvis Presley is long gone. Doesn't have adventures, never will again, as far as I can tell. And the same thing is true with the Legion of Superheroes. Another of my favorite comic book creations that does not exist anymore. It does not have a regular ongoing comic of any kind, much less 2 best-selling comics. So it's been extra touching. I don't know if I'll be around for an Epic Comic Book Wednesday next Wednesday, but if I am, we'll resume then. Hopefully Mike will be back in action. So I'll wrap this up for now, and I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.